I hadn't heard from her in a while, but it wasn't unusual. Life had a way of pulling us in different directions. Still, this time felt different. Christmas was supposed to be a time for family, for us to come together. I had planned on calling her, but I found myself too wrapped up in the hospital bed, weak from the surgery, too tired to pick up the phone. The doctors had said I needed rest, and I believed them. I thought she would understand, but she didn't. I found out by accident. Scrolling through my phone, my heart sank when I saw the notification. Missed call from Sarah. Then, another one, and another. My hands shook as I called her back, each ring echoing louder in my ear. It went straight to voicemail. I tried again, and again. Each time, the same thing. Voicemail. I didn't know then what I would find out later. I didn't know she had blocked me. It wasn't until the next day that I finally heard the truth from someone else. A family friend had called me, asking where I was. Sarah said you weren't coming, that you couldn't be bothered to show up. My stomach twisted in knots. She thought I didn't want to be there. She thought I had chosen to be away from her. I tried to tell myself that maybe she just didn't understand, that it was all a mistake. But the more I thought about it, the more my mind raced. How could she think that of me? How could she block me on Christmas Day of all days? The more I replayed the conversation in my head, the more it started to hurt. I thought of the hours I spent caring for her when she was little, the sacrifices I made, all those late nights helping with school projects, the times I missed work to be there when she needed me. And now, this, blocked. She thought I was abandoning her. I couldn't understand how she could so easily erase me from her life. But then something else occurred to me. The more I tried to reach her, the more she pulled away. It wasn't just the holiday, was it? Something had happened. Someone had been whispering in her ear, shaping her perception of me. I couldn't help but wonder, who had convinced her that I was the problem? I had to find out. I had to know why she felt this way. But as the days went by, she didn't answer my calls. She didn't respond to my messages. And the thought gnawed at me. Had I really lost my daughter? Just like that? What would she say when I finally found the courage to ask? What would I say to her? Would she even want to listen? What would you feel if your child erased you during the holiday you always cherished together? It's strange, isn't it? How something so ordinary as a phone call can hold so much weight. When you don't pick up, when you don't call back, the silence starts to speak louder than words. But sometimes silence isn't what it seems. I never wanted to cause her pain. I never meant for my absence to feel like abandonment. I had been in the hospital for 2 weeks. The doctors had warned me, but I still wasn't ready to face it. My body was failing, and the surgery was necessary. They said it was routine, but when you're lying in that sterile bed, day after day, all you can think about is the life you've lived and what's left to live. I was exhausted, aching from the procedure, and most days, I just wanted to sleep through it all. The first couple of days, I didn't even think about calling her. My mind was too clouded with recovery, with the fear that something could go wrong. Then, when I was finally clear-headed enough, I reached for my phone, but I hesitated. I had promised myself that I wouldn't worry her. She had enough on her plate with the wedding coming up. I didn't want her to see me as weak, frail, or needy. So, I let the silence stretch a little longer, convincing myself that I'd reach out soon. By the time Christmas rolled around, I was still too unwell to make it. It wasn't the holiday I had imagined, sitting in a cold, sterile room while the world went on without me. But the decision to hold back was mine. I didn't want her to see me like this, didn't want her to worry. I thought I was doing the right thing by staying quiet, but it was the worst thing I could have done. When she couldn't reach me, when I wasn't there to answer, she must have assumed I just didn't care. That's the thing about distance. It never feels neutral. In the absence of explanations, people fill in the gaps with their own stories. She didn't know I was struggling to even stay awake some days, much less make a phone call. What hurt the most was when I tried calling her back. My number wouldn't go through. I could barely focus long enough to send her a message, let alone make her understand that it wasn't neglect on my part. It was illness. But from her side, it must have seemed like a choice. That's how misunderstandings start, isn't it? A silence that grows and grows until it's too loud to ignore. I thought about the years I'd spent making sure she never wanted for anything. And yet now, when I needed her to understand, it seemed like nothing I'd done mattered. I could hear her voice in my head, asking where I was, but the truth was too complicated to explain in a text. How could I explain something I didn't fully understand myself? But somewhere between the confusion of my health and her perception, I lost her. The phone stayed silent, and the door between us closed just a little more. Do children truly understand when absence comes from necessity, not neglect? After she blocked my number, the calls I used to take for granted stopped. Days became weeks, and each unanswered attempt felt like another brick in the wall growing between us. I kept hoping she would reach out, that she would understand. But each day without her voice made the distance feel permanent. Even simple greetings were gone, replaced by emptiness that echoed through the corners of my home. I remember the small things first. The absence of a Merry Christmas text, the missing questions about my health, the casual check-ins that used to bring warmth to long, quiet days. Then the visit stopped. I would call, leave messages, but my words never reached her ears. At first, I tried to rationalize it. She's busy, caught up in her own life, but deep down, I knew something had shifted. And it wasn't just the calendar or the seasons. Old misunderstandings resurfaced in my mind. The choices I had made for her well-being, the rules and guidance I thought would protect her, now seemed to have been interpreted differently. In her absence, her imagination had filled in the gaps, painting me as cold, distant, perhaps even neglectful. I felt the weight of every decision I'd made, every limit I'd imposed, twisting under her gaze that I could no longer see. The first confrontation came unexpectedly. She spoke through a mutual friend who passed along her words. You never cared. You left me alone when it mattered most. My heart clenched. I could feel the sting of her words, even secondhand. It was hard not to take them personally. Yet I knew the truth was more complex. I had been in the hospital, confined by my own frailty, my inability to reach out a necessity, not a choice. But how could I explain that to someone so hurt, so certain of my neglect? Guilt gnawed at me. Could I have done more? Should I have called from the hospital despite my weakness? I wrestled with the thought that maybe, just maybe, I had failed her. But alongside that guilt was a clear understanding. I had acted out of care, out of love, not indifference. Holding those two truths together, my love and her perception, was exhausting, a constant mental balancing act that left me raw and uncertain. Even as I tried to reconcile these feelings, a small voice inside me whispered suspicion. Had someone influenced her view of me? I remembered her partner at the time, the quiet suggestions that my rules were too strict, that my care felt controlling. Perhaps those whispers, amplified over time, had contributed to the growing chasm between us. The thought unsettled me more than any accusation, because if true, it meant that her anger was directed not only at me, but had been shaped by external hands, and yet I could not intervene in a mind already closed to explanation. The silence continued, a bridge built from misunderstanding, unspoken fears, and manipulated perceptions. I found myself speaking into the emptiness, recounting my intentions, my sacrifices, my care, hoping that somehow the echo might reach her, but it never did. I began to understand how fragile relationships could be when communication fails. The smallest misinterpretation can fester, grow, and form walls so high that even truth struggles to climb them. Each unanswered call, each missed visit, widened the space between us, a gap I could feel but could not cross. I was left with memories of her as a child, laughing in my arms, playing in the snow, trusting me completely. The contrast between that trust and the current absence was unbearable. Helplessness and fear intertwined as I realized that the person I had nurtured now viewed me with suspicion and pain I could not immediately undo. In that silence, I learned the weight of absence, how even unintended distance can wound, and how misperceptions can grow in the fertile soil of misunderstanding. And as the days stretched on, I could only hold on to the truth of my love, waiting, hoping, though uncertain that it would ever be recognized. I had tried to make sense of her sudden distance on my own, but the silence kept growing, leaving me with nothing but questions and gnawing worry. Then a friend reached out, someone who had known our family for years and had always been quiet, observant, but kind. Their call came hesitantly, with careful words that carried more weight than any accusation could. I saw her, they said softly, the day she blocked you, and before that too. I listened, gripping the edge of my chair as they began to recount what they had noticed. They described her tension, the way she avoided even casual conversation, how she seemed burdened with worries she couldn't share openly. She smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes, they said. Her anxiety, her secrecy, it had been building long before the day she cut off contact, and they had seen it, just as clearly as I had felt it in the empty void left by her absence. The friend spoke slowly, deliberately, almost as if weighing each word. They told me that she'd been caught between loyalty to her own life, obligations to her fiancé, and the invisible weight of family expectations. She had felt pressure from multiple directions, and the things she believed about me, about my intentions, had been shaped quietly, persistently, by voices I couldn't hear. I felt a chill as I realized the timeline they described matched perfectly with when she first blocked me. Every subtle withdrawal, every missed call, every canceled visit now made sense in a painful, heartbreaking way. I thought back to the moments when she had seemed just a little distant, when her responses had become curt, when she hesitated before sharing news. At the time, I had attributed it to busyness or distraction, but now I understood it differently. Someone had been guiding her perceptions, twisting my actions into misjudged motives, coloring her understanding of my care as cold or controlling. And yet, this friend's words weren't meant to excuse her behavior. They were a lens to see the truth behind it, the unseen strain that had built the wall between us. As they continued, I felt sorrow mingling with validation. Sorrow for the fear and stress she carried silently, for the misperceptions that had grown without my knowledge, for the distance that had become almost insurmountable. Validation because, at last, someone had observed and confirmed what I had felt, that her withdrawal was not a reflection of my love or care, but a complex weave of misunderstanding, influence, and emotional weight too heavy for her to navigate alone. They spoke of subtle hints, her whispers to friends about being trapped, her careful avoidance of situations that might cause conflict, the tiny signs of stress that had gone unnoticed by everyone else. Each detail hit me harder than the last, like the slow peeling of a scab, exposing a wound I had barely understood existed. My heart ached for her struggle, for the isolation she must have felt. And yet, I could not dismiss the sting of betrayal that came with learning how misread my intentions had become. The friend paused, letting the silence fill the space between us. I tried to speak, but no words came immediately. It was too much to process, the mixture of sorrow, guilt, and validation pressing against me like a physical weight. I realized then that my confusion, my fear that I had failed her, was entwined with this newfound understanding. She had been carrying burdens I never saw, and my absence, though unintentional, had added to them. And yet, even in that painful clarity, I felt a flicker of hope. If someone else could see what I could not, perhaps there was still a way for her to understand my intentions. Perhaps the truth, carefully communicated, could bridge at least a part of the chasm that had formed. But I also understood that the influence of others, shaping her perceptions, was a reality I could not undo on my own. By the end of our conversation, I felt both heavy and strangely affirmed. I had confirmation that my love had never failed, that my intentions had been true, yet the cost of misunderstanding had left scars I could see but could not immediately heal. The bridge between us was still there, but now I understood the forces that had widened it, and the weight of her silence carried with it a complexity I could not ignore. I sat quietly afterward, letting the words settle, pondering what steps, if any, could be taken, and realizing the truth often comes from angles we least expect. And in that reflection, I could not help but ask myself, would you trust an outsider who saw your child struggle more clearly than you did? The day my friend called to share what she had observed, I braced myself, knowing the revelations would cut deeper than any direct confrontation. She began slowly, describing how someone close to my daughter, her fiancé, perhaps a friend, had quietly painted me in a harsh light. Words carefully chosen to suggest I had been negligent, uncaring, even controlling. The more she spoke, the heavier the weight pressed on my chest. I could feel the sharp sting of betrayal, even from the echo of their influence. She recounted moments I had long forgotten, conversations my daughter had shared in confidence, small grievances amplified by someone else's insistence. Every time I had tried to guide her, protect her, or offer support, these intentions had been twisted, reinterpreted through a lens of suspicion. I listened, numb, as the friend described how my actions, never meant to bind, but to nurture, had been reframed as restrictions, as if I had been withholding care or love. My stomach tightened at the thought of my daughter believing these false narratives, internalizing blame for needs I had never denied her. My mind wandered to her recent behaviors, the curt replies, the long silences, the avoidance of our calls. I had felt a coldness growing between us, but now the pieces clicked together in a painful mosaic. It wasn't just disappointment in me. It was fear, shame, and loyalty to a story she had been told. I could almost hear the whispers that had convinced her I was absent in ways I had never been. The weight of it all made my hands tremble slightly, and I pressed them against my knees, trying to steady a heart that felt both shattered and furious. The friend paused, allowing me to absorb the implications. She explained that my daughter had been caught in a conflict she couldn't name, torn between defending her own choices and the shame of believing I had been neglectful. I felt a mixture of sorrow and anger. Sorrow for her stress, the burden she had carried unknowingly, and anger at the deliberate shaping of her perceptions. Every bit of care I had given, every effort to be present, had been overshadowed by misinformation. I reflected on my own role, too. Had I missed opportunities to clarify? Had I been too silent, too trusting of her judgment, assuming she understood my intentions? The questions gnawed at me. I knew I couldn't undo what had been said, couldn't erase the impact of others' words. Yet I also realized that stepping forward too aggressively could push her further away. I was trapped between defending the truth and preserving what little connection remained. The friend continued, describing the subtle signs, hesitation in her voice, pauses before she spoke of family matters, avoidance of topics that might reveal her confusion. It became clear that the narrative she had inherited was powerful, convincing, and painful. It was a story that cast me in shadow, not because I deserved it, but because someone had carefully manipulated the perception of my intentions. Each anecdote struck me harder than the last, leaving a raw ache that pulsed from memory into the present. As the conversation drew to a close, I sat quietly, processing the painful validation. I understood now that my daughter's bitterness was not born from malice, but from a combination of fear, loyalty, and carefully seeded misinterpretation. It was not her fault entirely, yet the consequences of those false beliefs were real, and they had created a distance I feared might never fully heal. I was left with a solemn responsibility, to protect her from further pain without abandoning my own dignity, to hold the truth with care, and to navigate the fragile bridge between correction and compassion. The cortisol knowledge weighed on me, heavy and relentless, but it also offered clarity. I could see the forces that had shaped her judgment and feel the necessity of patience and restraint, even as my heart ached for the innocence lost between us. I chose a quiet afternoon for the conversation, hoping the calm would allow her to hear what I had to say. The room was small, softly lit, and yet the space between us felt impossibly wide. I started gently, explaining the days I had spent in the hospital, the urgency of my condition, and the silence I had maintained to avoid alarming anyone. Every word was carefully measured, carrying years of care that she had never seen. I wanted her to understand that my absence at Christmas was not neglect, but necessity. I spoke of the nights I had lain awake in sterile rooms, of the nurses checking vitals and the steady rhythm of heart monitors, thinking of her and how she would react if she knew. I tried to convey that the distance between us had not been my choice, that my concern had never wavered. Yet, as I watched her face, tight and defensive, I realized my words were not landing. There was a wall there, built from misunderstanding, fear, and stories told by voices I did not recognize. She listened, but her eyes darted away, and her arms folded as if to guard herself from the truth. When I finished, she responded, not with curiosity or questions, but with accusations drawn from the very narratives I had hoped to correct. She spoke of neglect, of coldness, of a father who had abandoned the holiday she cherished. Each statement was another weight pressing down on my chest, a reminder that the gap between intention and perception had become almost impossible to bridge. I tried again, softer this time, recounting specific instances when I had been there for her, times when my support had been silent but consistent. I wanted her to see the sacrifices, the care, the constant presence that had gone unnoticed. but each example seemed only to deepen her defensiveness. She repeated phrases she had heard elsewhere, words that painted me as controlling, unfeeling, or detached. It was a surreal, painful dance, each step revealing how far apart we had grown. The more she spoke, the clearer it became that my explanation alone could not erase the story she had accepted. The conversation, intended to heal, instead highlighted the distance I had tried to close. My hope waned with every defensive glance, every clipped sentence. I felt the familiar knot of sorrow and frustration tightening in my stomach. My care, my concern, my years of dedication, they were lost in a fog of misperception. I realized, with reluctant clarity, that boundaries were necessary to protect myself, to preserve the dignity that had been quietly eroded over time. I could not continue to push for understanding in a space that had become fraught with resentment. My silence, previously a sign of patience and respect, now seemed like a lifeline, a buffer against further harm to both of us. As we parted, I carried a mixture of sorrow and cautious acceptance. I mourned not just the immediate misunderstanding, but the accumulation of small moments that had led here. Missed opportunities, subtle miscommunications, and the insidious influence of outside voices. I understood that sometimes love and truth are not enough to bridge a gap built by fear and falsehood. In that moment, I made peace with stepping back, not out of defeat, but out of recognition that preservation of respect and self-worth sometimes requires measured distance. My heart ached, yes, but clarity came with the acknowledgement that the path to reconciliation was not mine to force. There was a weight to carry now, heavy but steady, a recognition that love must sometimes coexist with space, and that patience often holds more power than argument. The room felt impossibly quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your chest and makes every word feel heavier. She finally spoke, voice low, trembling with a mixture of guilt and shame. She admitted that she had misunderstood much of what I had tried to convey over the years, that my intentions had been misread and misjudged. Every sentence was a revelation, a painful confession that the image of me she had carried was not entirely her own creation, but shaped by whispers and suggestions she had believed. She described the voices that had influenced her, the friend, the colleague, the well-meaning partner who had convinced her that my care was overbearing, that my guidance had been controlling, that my absence had been neglect. Listening, I felt a deep ache, not anger at her, but sorrow at how fear and misinformation could distort love and trust. It became clear that her resentment was rooted not in cruelty, but in a protective fear of judgment, an attempt to shield herself from imagined pain. I saw her eyes flicker with shame as she recounted moments she had misinterpreted. Her misjudgments had grown over time, each one layering upon the last until they formed a barrier neither of us had foreseen. And yet, within that confession, there was honesty, a raw vulnerability that made the hurt sharper but also undeniable in its truth. I realized that my own pain had been compounded not merely by her silence, but by the invisible pressures shaping her perspective. The weight of our mutual wounds settled heavily between us. Every misunderstanding, every misinterpreted action, every unspoken word was laid bare. I felt sorrow for the child I had tried to guide and protect, for the mistakes I had made, for the moments where my care was insufficiently visible. But alongside that sorrow, a quiet anger arose, not at her, but at the circumstances and influences that had driven us to this distance. I mourned the erosion of our bond, the trust fractured by external narratives and unspoken assumptions. In that heavy room, I understood the limits of my influence as a parent. Love and sacrifice can only reach as far as the heart and mind of the child receiving it. Despite every effort, every gesture of care and support, there are forces beyond control, other opinions, pressures, misunderstandings that can shape perception in ways a parent cannot undo. I saw clearly that no amount of explanation could fully reverse the impact of fear and misperception. I reflected on the balance between holding on and letting go. The desire to correct the narrative, to prove the truth of my intentions, wrestled with the recognition that such efforts could deepen her shame or widen the divide. Sometimes the most compassionate act is to step back, to protect the dignity of both, and to accept that not all wounds can be immediately healed. Her admission also forced me to confront my own limitations. Years of guidance, support, and care had not guaranteed understanding or gratitude. It was a stark reminder that sacrifice and effort do not always translate into recognition, and that love can coexist with distance, misunderstanding, and even resentment. As we sat in that quiet, I felt both the weight of sorrow and the flicker of clarity. Our emotional wounds were mutual, undeniable, and layered with complexity. And yet, within that acknowledgement, there was a fragile sort of peace, not in resolution, but in the honest recognition of human imperfection, the fragility of trust, and the boundaries imposed by circumstance. I left the conversation carrying a heavy heart, tempered by understanding. Fear, misjudgment, and silence had shaped our distance, but clarity had begun to pierce the darkness. There was no immediate resolution, no sudden reconciliation, only the slow, careful comprehension of the intricate threads that had brought us here, and the quiet acceptance that some truths must exist alongside unhealed wounds. The phone sat quietly on the table, its screen dim, a constant reminder of the distance that had settled between us. The blocked number stared back at me, a symbol of so much unspoken, so much lost. I had once looked at that phone with anticipation, hoping for a call, a message, anything that might bridge the gap that had widened over time. But now, it only served as a painful reminder of how far we had come and how far we still had to go. I thought about the day she blocked me, Christmas, a day that should have been filled with warmth, but instead was marked by silence. I had tried to call, to explain, but it felt as though every attempt only pushed her further away. The phone had become an object of grief, an unwilling witness to a relationship now in tatters. And with that silence came a quiet grief that I couldn't escape, a grief that lingered in the empty space where understanding once resided. There were moments, fleeting and uncertain, when I wondered if revealing the truth to her would heal the rift between us. I thought about what she believed, the misconceptions that had festered in the absence of clarity. Would explaining everything, my hospitalization, my absence, bring her back? Or would it fracture what little was left of our bond? The truth was, I wasn't sure. In my heart, I knew there was no easy answer. Some things were too complicated, too fragile to untangle without causing more damage. It wasn't just about the facts. It was about perception, about years of misunderstandings that couldn't be erased by a single conversation. I feared that telling her everything might only push her further away, but keeping the truth hidden might also leave both of us in a state of unresolved tension, each of us holding on to a story that wasn't quite right. I had spent so much time trying to mend what had been broken, trying to fix what wasn't easily repaired. But now, in the quiet of that moment, I began to understand that not all wounds could be healed immediately. Not all misunderstandings could be cleared up in one conversation. Sometimes, time alone would do the healing, but it would be slow. I had to accept that, just as I had to accept the distance between us. I thought about the lessons I had learned through all of this. The most painful truth was that we cannot always control how others see us or how they interpret our actions. Despite all my sacrifices, my love, my attempts to guide, I had become a figure of frustration, of blame, rather than one of support. I had wanted to protect her, but in doing so, I had perhaps pushed too hard, given too much of myself without asking for anything in return. And in the end, the very thing I sought to protect, the bond between us, had been strained beyond repair. But in that realization, I found a quiet strength. It wasn't the strength of someone who had won, but the strength of someone who had come to terms with the reality of the situation. The truth of it was that some things simply could not be fixed, not with words, not with action, but only with time and understanding. And as much as I wished for a different outcome, I had to accept that sometimes silence would speak louder than anything I could say. As I sat there looking at that empty phone, I knew that the distance between us was not just physical, but emotional. And yet, in that silence, I also found a kind of peace. The pain was still there, lingering in the background, but it was no longer consuming me. I had done all I could, and now I had to let go. The boundaries I had once struggled against now felt like the only thing keeping me whole. I couldn't control her perception of me, but I could control how I responded. And so, I would let silence speak. Should I reveal the truth, or let silence preserve the world she believes?